Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. When we think of slavery, our minds often jump to the plantations of the American South, images of cotton fields, brutal overseers, and the long struggle for freedom. But what if I told you that Canada, often celebrated as a sanctuary for runaway slaves via the Underground Railroad, has its own hidden history of slavery? This is a side of Canadian history rarely taught in schools and almost never featured in mainstream narratives. Canada is commonly portrayed as a land of liberty, a safe northern refuge for African Americans fleeing bondage in the United States. And while that image is partly true, it only tells half the story. Long before the Underground Railroad and even during its operation, slavery existed right here on Canadian soil. Both French and British colonial powers enslaved Indigenous people and Africans, weaving slavery into the foundation of early Canadian society. In this video, we're going to uncover the truth about slavery in Canada, from the little-known enslavement of Indigenous peoples during the 1600s to the presence of African slaves in households and businesses throughout Quebec, Ontario, and the Maritimes. We'll explore the laws that protected this system, the lives of those enslaved, and the resistance that followed. By the end, you'll see that Canada's legacy on slavery is more complex and more troubling than most people realize. Slavery in Canada didn't begin with British rule. It took root much earlier during the era of New France in the 1600s. Contrary to the myth of Canada as untouched by slavery, French colonists actively participated in the buying, selling, and owning of human beings. Two primary groups were enslaved during this time: Indigenous people, often referred to as panis, a generic term applied to enslaved Indigenous captives regardless of their actual nation, and Africans, brought across the Atlantic as part of the growing Atlantic slave trade. The first recorded slave in New France arrived in the early 1620s with Louis Hébert, a settler and apothecary in Quebec who owned a young African boy. From then on, slavery slowly embedded itself in the colony's daily life. Gilles Auquard, the intendant of New France in the 18th century, oversaw a period of administrative growth that included a rise in the number of enslaved people. By the mid-1700s, it's estimated that around 3,600 enslaved individuals, about two-thirds Indigenous and one-third African, lived in what is now Quebec and parts of Ontario and the Maritimes. Though France's Code Noir, Black Code, a decree originally meant to regulate slavery in the Caribbean, was never formally enacted in New France, it still heavily influenced legal and social practices. Enslaved people had no legal personhood. They were considered property, and their lives were controlled by their owners. They worked in households, on farms, and as laborers in towns and military outposts. Some were baptized into the Catholic faith, but this did little to change their status or treatment. Slavery in New France was not based on large-scale plantation agriculture like in the Caribbean or the American South. Instead, it was domestic and dispersed, woven quietly into daily life. Yet the brutality and dehumanization were very real. Owners had complete control over the lives of the enslaved, who they married, what they wore, where they slept, and whether they lived or died. This early system laid the groundwork for the continued presence of slavery even after the British took control in 1763. After the British took control of New France in 1763, slavery didn't end. It simply shifted hands. Under British rule, the enslavement of both Africans and Indigenous peoples continued, now under the legal and social systems of British North America. The British brought with them a legal framework that supported slavery, and colonial elites quickly adapted it to the Canadian context. Enslaved people were now found not just in Quebec, formerly New France, but increasingly in what became Upper Canada, modern-day Ontario, as well. One major turning point came with the arrival of the Loyalists following the American Revolutionary War in the 1780s. These were British colonists who remained loyal to the Crown and fled the newly formed United States, many of them settling in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Upper Canada. Along with their families, livestock, and possessions, many Loyalists brought enslaved people with them. These individuals, often of African descent, were forced to build new communities, homes, and economies for others, even as they were denied basic freedom and personhood. By this point, slavery in Canada was still domestic in scale but widely accepted in elite circles. Enslaved Africans worked as cooks, laborers, house servants, and farmhands, while some indigenous people were still held as slaves, especially in Quebec. Historical records show that by the early 1800s there were an estimated 4,000 enslaved people living in what is now Canada. Their lives were controlled by wealthy merchants, politicians, and clergy, some of the very figures praised in Canadian historical memory. In Upper Canada, slavery was legal and protected by property law. In Lower Canada, Quebec, it was more entrenched and culturally accepted due to its French colonial roots. Enslaved individuals had virtually no legal recourse if abused, sold, or separated from family. Their labor was integral to the development of early Canadian society, yet their presence was almost entirely erased from mainstream historical narratives. This period laid bare a contradiction that still lingers in the national imagination. While Canada would later become known for helping enslaved people escape from the United States, it also quietly upheld slavery within its own borders. The legacy of British rule didn't just preserve slavery, it embedded it into the legal and economics foundation of early Canada. Despite the harsh conditions and legal barriers, enslaved people in Canada did not passively accept their fate. Acts of resistance, both quiet and bold, were woven into daily life. Some resisted by refusing orders or slowing down work. Others took far greater risks, escaping bondage altogether and seeking freedom in nearby Indigenous communities or even across colonial borders. These individual acts of defiance kept alive the idea that freedom was possible, even in a system built to deny it. One of the most powerful examples of resistance came from Chloe Cooley, a young Black woman enslaved in Upper Canada. In 1793, she was violently bound and forced across the Niagara River by her enslaver, who planned to sell her in the United States, where slavery remained widespread. Cooley's screams and struggle were witnessed by several locals who reported the incident. Though she was never freed and disappeared from the historical record, her case became a turning point. The brutality of her abduction sparked public outrage and pushed Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe to act. In response, the 1793 Act to limit slavery was passed in Upper Canada. Though it didn't abolish slavery outright, it was the first piece of anti-slavery legislation in the British Empire. It banned the importation of new enslaved people into the province and allowed for gradual emancipation by declaring that children born to enslaved mothers after that date would be freed at the age of 25. The law was a compromise, designed to appease slave-owning loyalists while signaling a slow move toward abolition. This act marked the beginning of legal resistance against slavery in Canada, and while it left many still in bondage, it set the stage for future change. Public sentiment gradually shifted, especially as abolitionist ideas spread from Britain and parts of the U.S. Black loyalists and free Black communities also advocated for their rights, forming the backbone of a growing resistance to slavery across British North America. These stories of resistance, of individuals like Chloe Cooley and the laws sparked by their courage, show that the road to freedom in Canada was not handed down from above. It was carved out by the determination and bravery of the enslaved themselves, supported by those who chose to witness and act. In 1833, the British Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act, which legally ended slavery across most of the British Empire, including Canada. This law marked the formal end of a system that had persisted for over 2 centuries, affecting thousands of Indigenous and African people across what would become Canadian territory. Though Canada's form of slavery was not plantation-based like in the American South, it was no less real for those who lived it, and the law meant that, officially, they could no longer be considered property. By the time of abolition, the number of enslaved individuals in Canada had already declined significantly due to earlier restrictions, such as the 1793 Act in Upper Canada. Still, some people were living in bondage right up until the law took effect in 1834. With abolition, these individuals were legally freed, though few records detail what happened to them afterward. Many entered society with no compensation, support, or recognition. Freedom didn't erase the poverty, discrimination, and trauma they faced. Their stories, like their labor, were often written out of the national narrative. Canada's path to abolition stands in contrast to that of the United States, where slavery ended through a brutal civil war 3 decades later. In Canada, abolition came gradually and through legislation rather than conflict. Yet this peaceful ending can be misleading. It wasn't the absence of violence that freed Canada's enslaved. It was the pressure from those who resisted, who escaped, who bore witness, and who refused to let their humanity be denied. The legal shift in 1833 closed a dark chapter, but it also opened the door to a long, unfinished struggle for justice, equality, and historical truth. The history of slavery in Canada has long been left out of mainstream education, rarely appearing in textbooks or classroom discussions. This omission isn't accidental. It reflects a national tendency to frame Canada as a land of freedom, particularly in contrast to the United States. The popular narrative focuses heavily on Canada's role in the Underground Railroad, where freedom seekers escaped American slavery, while downplaying the fact that Canada once upheld slavery itself. This selective memory has contributed to the erasure of a painful but vital part of the country's past. The impact of this forgotten history is still felt today. Black communities in Canada continue to grapple with the long shadow of enslavement, visible in systemic inequality, economic disparity, and underrepresentation. Generations of Black Canadians, many descended from enslaved or marginalized ancestors, have faced barriers in housing, education, and employment. Understanding the roots of these challenges means acknowledging how slavery and its legacy shaped Canadian institutions and society, even if the system ended nearly 2 centuries ago. Recognizing this history is more than just a matter of correcting the record. It's essential for building an inclusive future. Efforts are growing to bring this history to light through museum exhibits, academic research, community activism, and curriculum reform. The more Canadians learn about the full truth of their past, the better equipped they are to confront injustice in the present. Acknowledging the reality of slavery in Canada doesn't diminish the country's ideals. It deepens them by grounding them in honesty, resilience, and the lived experiences of those whose stories were long silenced. Canada's history with slavery is often hidden beneath layers of national myth, but the truth reveals a much more complex and uncomfortable past. From the early days of French and British colonization to the stories of resistance and the eventual fight for freedom, we see that slavery was not just an American story, it was a Canadian one too. Enslaved Indigenous and African peoples helped build the foundations of this country, even as their own lives were controlled and erased from memory. Understanding this history forces us to reconsider what we think we know about Canada. It challenges the narrative of a peaceful, progressive nation and calls us to recognize the people who fought for freedom long before abolition was law. These are stories that deserve to be told, not just as footnotes, but as fundamental chapters in Canada's past. History isn't always what we're told. Keep questioning, keep learning. If this story opened your eyes, give it a like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more untold histories that deserve the spotlight.